Most people believe countries collapse loudly. They imagine riots in the streets, banks shutting their doors overnight, markets crashing in a single dramatic moment. But real economic collapse almost never begins with chaos. It begins quietly, so quietly that most people don't even notice it happening. Life feels normal. Paychecks still arrive. Stores are still open. The news still talks about growth, innovation, and optimism. And that false sense of stability is exactly what makes collapse so dangerous. Because by the time the warning signs become obvious, the damage is already irreversible. And right now, many nations around the world are standing on the same path, not because of one bad decision, but because of a long chain of choices that seemed harmless at the time. This is the story of how nations slowly fall into economic failure, not through sudden disaster, but through comfort, denial, and debt. And once you understand this pattern, you will never look at headlines, government promises, or financial news the same way again. Before we go any further, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because here on Global Economy Decoded, we break down complex global financial systems into clear, honest stories that actually make sense. And if you want to understand how money, power, and economics really work behind the scenes, you are in the right place. Now let's begin at the very start, because every economic collapse follows a surprisingly similar pattern. It always starts with growth, real growth. A nation becomes productive. It builds industries, exports goods, creates jobs, and raises living standards. People work, save, invest, and plan for the future. Confidence grows, credit expands, banks lend more, governments collect more taxes. Everything feels sustainable. But this is where the first mistake quietly enters the system. Growth becomes expected, not hoped for, but assumed. Governments start building budgets that only work if growth continues forever. Social programs expand. Military spending rises. Infrastructure projects multiply. None of these decisions feel reckless on their own because the economy seems strong enough to handle them. Then debt enters the picture not as an emergency tool, but as a convenience. Borrowing becomes easier than making hard choices. Instead of raising taxes or cutting spending, governments borrow. Instead of slowing growth to cool the system, central banks lower interest rates to keep momentum alive. Debt stops being a temporary bridge and becomes a permanent feature of the economy. At first, debt feels harmless. It even feels helpful. Borrowing fuels expansion. It boosts asset prices. Stocks rise. Housing markets heat up. People feel wealthier, even if their real productivity hasn't changed. Politicians celebrate this as success. Media outlets amplify the optimism, and anyone who warns about long-term risks is labeled pessimistic, outdated, or even unpatriotic. But debt has a hidden cost most people don't see. Debt pulls future growth into the present. It allows a nation to spend tomorrow's money today, and the more a country borrows, the more future growth it needs just to stay stable. At some point, growth stops being optional and becomes mandatory. This is where the system begins to quietly crack. As debt grows, interest payments grow with it. Governments start spending more money just to service old debt, instead of investing in productive areas like education, infrastructure, or innovation. Productivity slows, wages stagnate. But instead of fixing the root problem, policymakers reach for the same tool again: more borrowing, more stimulus, more short-term fixes. Central banks step in and lower interest rates even further. This makes debt cheaper, but it also encourages more risk. Investors chase higher returns. Asset bubbles form. Housing prices detach from incomes. Stock markets detach from economic reality. The economy starts looking strong on paper, while everyday life becomes more expensive for ordinary people. This creates a dangerous illusion. Wealth appears to be everywhere, but it is concentrated in assets, not productivity. And assets depend on confidence. The moment confidence weakens, the entire structure becomes fragile. History shows us this pattern again and again. Ancient Rome debased its currency to fund endless spending. Spain flooded its economy with silver and triggered massive inflation. The British Empire overextended itself financially after 2 world wars. And more recently, we've seen similar dynamics in countries like Argentina, Greece, and Venezuela. Different systems, different eras, same underlying mechanics. What makes modern collapses especially dangerous is that they don't happen in isolation. Today's global economy is deeply interconnected. When one major system weakens, shockwaves spread everywhere, trade slows, currencies fluctuate, capital moves at the speed of a click, and because the US dollar sits at the center of this system, stress anywhere eventually feeds back into everything. One of the most misunderstood aspects of economic collapse is timing. People always ask, when will it happen? But that's the wrong question. Collapse is not a date on a calendar, it's a process. A slow erosion of trust, credibility, and stability. Most people only recognize it in hindsight. During the early stages, governments can still function. Elections still happen. Businesses still operate. But behind the scenes, options disappear. Every year, policymakers have fewer tools available. Interest rates approach zero. Debt levels reach historic highs. Inflation becomes politically sensitive. And at that point, even small shocks become dangerous. A recession that would have been manageable in a healthier system suddenly becomes catastrophic. A banking failure triggers panic. A geopolitical conflict disrupts energy markets. A loss of confidence in a currency causes capital flight. And because the system was already stretched to its limits, there is no margin for error. What makes this even more troubling is human psychology. People are wired to assume tomorrow will look like today. As long as things appear normal, most individuals don't prepare. They don't question the system. They don't demand reform. They don't change their behavior. Comfort becomes the enemy of awareness. This is why the early phase of collapse is often the calmest. No panic, no headlines screaming disaster, just quiet adjustments, prices rising slightly faster than wages, savings losing value slowly, debt becoming harder to manage, opportunities narrowing for younger generations. None of these changes feel dramatic on their own, but together they reshape the entire society. Eventually, something breaks the illusion. Sometimes it's inflation that can't be hidden anymore. Sometimes it's a currency crisis. Sometimes it's a debt default. And when that moment arrives, governments are forced to make painful choices quickly. Austerity, capital controls, bailouts, emergency powers, and by then public trust is already damaged. The tragic part is that collapse rarely affects everyone equally. Those closest to financial power often protect themselves first. They move capital, hedge risk, adapt early, while ordinary citizens absorb the shock through lost purchasing power, unemployment, and reduced social support. This gap fuels anger, polarization, and instability, making recovery even harder. And this is why economic collapse is not really about numbers. It's about incentives, behavior, and time. It's about what happens when short-term comfort consistently overrides long-term responsibility. This is exactly why Global Economy Decoded exists, not to spread fear, but to build understanding. Because informed people make better decisions, and awareness is the first step toward resilience as we move closer to the present day. The question is no longer whether debt-driven systems are under stress. The question is how societies respond to that stress. Some choose reform, others choose denial, and history shows us which path ends badly. So as this video comes to an end, I want you to think about your own perspective. Do you see these patterns in the world around you? Do you feel the quiet pressure building beneath the surface? If so, you're not alone, and if this analysis resonated with you, drop a comment below and share your thoughts, because conversations matter, especially in times like these. And if you believe more people need to understand how nations slowly fall into economic failure, share this video with them, because the system does not break all at once, it breaks quietly, and awareness always comes before change.